I never set out to become the guy with a problem. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said I was just blowing off steam like everyone else. A few beers after work. A couple more on the weekend. It felt earned. I had a job, a wife who loved me, a kid who thought I was a superhero. From the outside, my life looked stable, even successful. The thing about addiction, at least in my case, is that it didn't arrive like a storm. It came like fog, slow, quiet, almost comforting at first. Alcohol became my way to turn the volume down on stress, fear, and the constant feeling that I wasn't enough. One drink became my signal that the day was over, and I could finally breathe. 2 drinks became my reward. 3 became my routine. I told myself all the lies that probably sound familiar to anyone reading this. I can stop anytime. I'm not like those people. I still go to work. I still provide. What I didn't admit was how much it was already taking from me. I started missing dinners because I worked late. I snapped at my wife over nothing. I stopped being present with my kid, even when I was physically there. My world slowly narrowed to the space between the bottle and whatever excuse I needed to justify the next one. This is hard to write, because admitting how early it started means admitting how long I ignored it. But if I'm being honest, and that's the whole point of this post, my addiction didn't just affect my life, it quietly started to hollow it out. And at the time, I was the last person willing to see it. For a long time, I thought the damage was minimal, or at least manageable. Bills were paid. No one was homeless. I wasn't waking up in gutters or getting arrested. In my head, that meant I was fine. But addiction has a way of lowering your standards without you noticing. What once would have scared me started to feel normal. My wife noticed before I did, or maybe she noticed and I chose not to listen. She'd ask why I smelled like alcohol on a Tuesday night. I'd joke it off. She'd say I seemed distant, angry, checked out. I told her she was overreacting. Looking back, that might be one of the hardest truths. I didn't just drink. I gaslit the person who loved me most so I wouldn't have to face myself. At work, my patience thinned. I was either irritable or numb. I started counting the hours until I could go home and drink, not because I wanted to celebrate, but because I needed to feel normal again. That should have been a warning sign. Instead, I treated it like a coping strategy. The shame crept in quietly. I'd promise myself I wouldn't drink that night, then break that promise before dinner. I stopped trusting myself, but I didn't know how to say that out loud, so I drank to drown out the guilt of drinking. That cycle became my baseline. The worst part is that I still believed I was in control. I thought addiction looked like rock bottom, sirens, handcuffs, ultimatums. I didn't realize it could look like a tired man on a couch, beer in hand, convincing himself tomorrow would be different. The turning point didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single dramatic explosion, no police, no hospital bed, no viral moment of public shame. It was quieter than that, which almost makes it worse. It was a collection of looks, silences, and things left unsaid that finally broke through my denial. One night, I came home later than I said I would, again. My wife was sitting at the kitchen table, not yelling, not crying, just exhausted. That scared me more than anger ever could. She asked me a simple question: "Are you even here with us anymore?" I opened my mouth to defend myself, and nothing came out. For the first time, I didn't have a believable lie. My kid walked past us on the way to bed, and didn't say goodnight. That sounds small, but it wasn't. That was the moment it hit me that my addiction wasn't just hurting me, or my marriage. It was teaching my child who I was, or worse, who I wasn't. That night, after everyone went to sleep, I stood in the kitchen, staring at an empty bottle. Instead of comfort, I felt this crushing clarity. I saw the future, if nothing changed. More distance, more resentment, more nights like this, until one day there was no one left waiting for me to come home. I realized then that I wasn't drinking because life was hard. Life was hard because I was drinking. And for the first time, The thought scared me more than the idea of quitting. The next morning, the fear didn't magically disappear. If anything, it settled in deeper. I woke up with that familiar mix of regret and anxiety. But this time, there was something else underneath it. Resolve, shaky and uncertain, but real. I knew I couldn't unsee what I'd seen the night before. I didn't make any big declarations. I didn't pour the bottles down the sink, or post some dramatic promise online. All I did was admit one thing to myself, quietly and honestly. I can't do this alone. That admission felt like failure at first. I'd spent my whole life believing I was supposed to handle my problems by myself. Asking for help felt like giving up control. I started with the hardest conversation of my life. I told my wife, I thought I had a problem. I didn't soften it. I didn't joke. I didn't minimize. I said the words out loud, and waited for her reaction. She cried. Not in relief, not in anger, but in something closer to grief. She told me she'd been waiting years to hear me say that. That conversation didn't fix anything, but it changed the direction of everything. For the first time, the problem wasn't hidden between us. It was out in the open, ugly and uncomfortable, but real. We talked about boundaries. We talked about trust, or how little of it was left, and we talked about what would happen if I didn't take this seriously. That was my first step. Not sobriety, not recovery, just honesty. And it was terrifying. Once the truth was out, there was no pretending anymore. I couldn't unring that bell. The next question was obvious and overwhelming. What now? Admitting I had a problem didn't magically give me the tools to fix it. I made the call to a local addiction counselor on my lunch break, sitting in my car so no one at work could hear. My hands were shaking as I left a voicemail, and I remember thinking how ridiculous it was that making a phone call felt harder than years of drinking. But when they called me back and scheduled an appointment, it suddenly felt real, too real to back out of. The first session was humbling. I expected judgment. I expected a lecture. Instead, I was asked questions I'd spent years avoiding. When did you start drinking to cope? What are you afraid of when you're sober? What are you trying not to feel? I didn't have good answers. Sometimes I didn't have any answers at all. But for the first time, someone wasn't letting me hide behind "I'm fine." I also started attending a support group. Walking into that room was one of the most uncomfortable things I've ever done. I was convinced I didn't belong there, that my story wasn't bad enough. That belief lasted about 10 minutes. When I heard other people talk, I realized addiction doesn't care about job titles, income, or appearances. It sounds different, but it feels the same. I didn't walk out of those early days feeling cured or confident. I walked out feeling exposed and fragile, but I also walked out knowing I'd taken another step forward instead of another drink. And for once, that felt like progress. Early recovery was nothing like the clean, inspirational stories I'd imagined. It was messy, uncomfortable, and deeply unglamorous. The alcohol was gone, but everything it had been numbing came rushing back in. Stress felt sharper. Emotions felt louder. Silence felt unbearable. At home, things were tense. My wife wanted to support me, but she was cautious, and she had every right to be. Trust doesn't reset just because someone says they're trying. Every late arrival, every change in tone, every bad day came with questions neither of us wanted to ask out loud. I had to learn to live with that, without getting defensive. Friends were another challenge. Some didn't understand why I suddenly stopped drinking. A few joked about it. Others drifted away when I stopped being the fun, always down for another round guy. That hurt more than I expected. I realized how many of my relationships were built around the same habit that was destroying me. The cravings were relentless in those first weeks. They didn't always scream. Sometimes they whispered, "You've had a rough day. One won't hurt." You're doing better now. I had to learn that those thoughts weren't truth. They were symptoms. Recognizing that didn't make them disappear, but it gave me a fighting chance. There were nights I sat in my car after work, gripping the steering wheel, just waiting for the urge to pass. I didn't feel strong in those moments. I felt desperate, but I stayed. I breathed. And when I finally drove home sober, it felt like winning a battle no one else could see. Support, I learned, isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like quiet consistency. My wife started checking in with me, not to police me, but to understand where my head was at. Some days I could talk. Other days I just said I'm struggling. And that was enough. She didn't try to fix it. She just listened. That mattered more than I knew how to say. My family had mixed reactions when I told them. Some were proud. Some were skeptical. A few said things like, just don't drink so much, which told me they didn't really understand what I was dealing with. I had to accept that not everyone would get it. And that was okay. Recovery isn't a group project. It's personal work supported by others, not defined by their approval. In my support group, I started to open up more. At first I spoke in generalities, keeping things safe and vague. But the more I listened to others be brutally honest about their failures and fears, the harder it was to keep hiding. When I finally shared how scared I was of failing my family again, no one looked shocked. No one judged me. They nodded, because they'd been there too. That sense of being understood, truly understood, was new to me. I wasn't the screw-up friend, or the disappointing husband in that room. I was just another person trying to get through the day without giving in. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone in the fight. I wish I could say the cravings got easier in a straight line. They didn't. Some days felt manageable, almost calm. Other days hit out of nowhere, and knocked the air out of me. Stress, celebration, boredom. It all became a trigger. Once alcohol was no longer my default response. The first real relapse scare came after an argument with my wife. It wasn't even a huge fight, just one of those conversations where old wounds get reopened. She questioned whether things were actually changing, or if this was just another phase. I understood why she felt that way, but hearing it still hurt. That night, the urge to drink felt overwhelming. I stood in a liquor store parking lot for a long time, engine running, telling myself I just needed something to make the pain stop. I didn't go in. I called someone from my support group instead. I hated making that call. It felt embarrassing, like admitting weakness. But he answered, talked me through it, and stayed on the line until the urge passed. When I hung up, I sat there shaking, realizing how close I'd come to undoing everything. That moment taught me something important. Recovery isn't about never wanting to drink again. It's about what you do when you really want to. White-knuckling it alone wasn't going to work for me. Reaching out didn't make me weaker. It kept me sober that night. I went home and told my wife what had happened. She didn't celebrate. She didn't scold me. She just said thank you for telling me. That was another small step toward rebuilding trust, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. Relapse, I learned, isn't always a dramatic fall off the cliff. Sometimes it starts in your head long before it ever reaches your hands. For me, it showed up as bargaining. Maybe I don't need meetings anymore. Maybe I was never that bad. Maybe I could handle it now. Those thoughts scared me more than the cravings themselves, because they sounded reasonable. There were days I slipped emotionally. Even if I didn't drink, I'd shut down. I'd get irritable. I'd avoid conversations I knew I should have. My therapist helped me see that these patterns were part of the same addiction mindset, avoiding discomfort at all costs. Alcohol had just been my most effective tool. One weekend I actually did relapse. I'm not proud of it, but I won't lie about it either. It happened after a family gathering, where everyone else was drinking and laughing, and I felt like an outsider in my own life. I told myself I deserved to feel normal for one night. One drink turned into several. The next morning was brutal. Not because of the hangover, but because of the shame. I wanted to hide it. I wanted to pretend it didn't happen, and start over quietly. But recovery had already taught me something important. Secrets are fuel for addiction, so I told the truth. To my wife, to my counselor. It was humiliating, and it hurt to see the disappointment in my wife's eyes. But something unexpected happened too. No one told me I was hopeless. No one said I'd ruined everything. They reminded me that relapse is information, not a verdict. That didn't erase the damage, but it kept me from giving up entirely. And that mattered more than I realized at the time. Getting back on track after the relapse was harder than getting sober the first time. The self-doubt was louder now. I kept thinking, if I failed once, what's stopping me from failing again? That voice was relentless, and on bad days it almost convinced me that trying was pointless. What helped was reframing the goal. My counselor told me to stop focusing on never drinking again, and start focusing on not drinking today. That sounded almost too simple, but it worked. I didn't have to win the rest of my life. I just had to get through the next hour, the next conversation, the next craving. I also had to face the damage I'd caused more directly. My wife and I started couples counseling. Those sessions were uncomfortable in a different way. There was no hiding behind addiction language or recovery milestones. We talked about broken promises, resentment, and the fear that she was wasting her life, waiting for me to change. Hearing that hurt, but it was honest. Slowly, I started building routines that didn't revolve around avoidance. Morning walks instead of sleeping off hangovers. Writing things down when my thoughts spiraled. Actually eating meals instead of skipping them so I could drink. These weren't dramatic transformations. They were small, boring choices that added up over time. I still didn't trust myself completely, but I was learning how to show up even when I felt unsure. And for the first time since that relapse, I started to believe that progress didn't mean perfection. It meant persistence. One of the hardest parts of recovery has been rebuilding relationships that addiction strained or nearly broke. My child especially didn't understand why I was so different some days. I'd show up at the park, distracted, or promise we'd do something and cancel. Those little betrayals stacked up over the years. I started small. I committed to being fully present during bedtime routines, helping with homework, and going to weekend activities without checking my phone or thinking about the next drink. At first my kid was skeptical, half expecting me to vanish or snap. But over time, the small consistent moments started to matter. Slowly, the little smile I got when I read a story, or pushed them on the swing, felt like a victory. Friends were trickier. Some had drifted away entirely. Others were wary. I had to accept that I couldn't force people to trust me again. I could only show them, through actions, that I was serious about change. That meant turning down invitations I used to associate with drinking, avoiding certain social circles, and finding new communities where sobriety was normal. It was exhausting, socially, emotionally, mentally. This process took more energy than I thought I had. But every time someone acknowledged my effort, even in small ways, a text checking in, a "glad you're here," it reinforced that I wasn't alone, and that I was doing the right work. Progress wasn't linear, but the fact that I could see tiny improvements gave me hope. It wasn't about curing the past, it was about building trust day by day, brick by brick. The cravings never fully disappeared, but they changed shape over time. They became less about escape, and more about comfort, an old habit whispering, "This will make things easier." I learned to recognize those moments before they became dangerous. Sometimes that meant stepping outside, calling a friend, or writing down every thought racing through my mind. I started journaling more seriously. Writing down how I felt, what triggered me, and how I responded became a way to catch patterns I couldn't see in the moment. Some days, the pages were filled with anger, guilt, and self-loathing. Other days there were small victories, like going to a family event sober, or choosing to listen instead of reacting. Looking back over those journals, I could see real change happening. even when I couldn't feel it in the moment. Therapy and support groups remained anchors. Hearing the stories of people who'd relapsed multiple times, but kept showing up reminded me that recovery isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. Every time I shared my struggles openly, I felt less isolated. Every time someone else shared theirs, I realized I wasn't unique in my fear, shame, or mistakes. Even with progress, guilt lingered. I felt guilty for the years I wasn't fully present, for the broken promises, for the nights my family had to tiptoe around me. But I also learned that guilt can be a motivator, if it's channeled properly. It reminded me why I needed to keep going, for them and for myself.